All right, everyone, let us settle in. Tonight, we are exploring one of the most dreaded occupations in medieval Europe, the role of the executioner. And that is truly saying something in a time when rat catcher and full-time plague survivor were considered legitimate ways to make a living. From swinging the sword of civic justice to being cursed, feared, and socially banished, the life of a medieval executioner was a strange and brutal paradox. He was a necessary figure, but one who was never truly welcome. So, before you get too comfortable, please feel free to take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I am creating here. And I would love for you to let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always a true fascination to see our community connecting from every corner of the globe. For now, go ahead and dim your lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that soft, ambient hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. So, you have just been born? Congratulations! You are the newest arrival in a proud, multi-generational family of medieval executioners. That is right. While other infants are swaddled in soft linen and are destined for lives as bakers, butchers, or, if fortune smiles upon them, monks, you are gently laid in a cradle that sits beside a whetstone and an axe. That is not a toy rattle you are holding. It is a destiny. In the Middle Ages, the role of an executioner was not a position one applied for. There was no process for submitting a resume at the town hall. It was a trade passed down through blood, like a cursed and unavoidable heirloom. If your father was the executioner, you were destined to be the next one. It was as simple as that. There was no possibility of a career change, no dreaming of becoming a traveling minstrel or a melancholy shoemaker. Your life's path was set in stone, and it led directly to the chopping block. From the moment you are old enough to take your first steps, you are already met with the sideways glances of the villagers. Other children scatter when you approach the well. The adults in town lower their voices to a whisper as you pass by, as though your small toddler hands were already stained with symbolic blood. And in a way, they already are. You grow up in a home where the conversations around the dinner table are less about, "How was your day?" and more about, "How many swings do you think it should take to ensure a clean separation?" There is no escaping this reality. Your toys might be miniature gallows, and your bedtime fables are more likely to include phrases like drawing and quartering than happily ever after. And it is not just the job itself. It is the pervasive reputation that clings to you like a shadow. You could be the kindest, most well-read, and soft-spoken child in the entire kingdom, yet people would still treat you as if you sneak into homes at night to whisper threats to their chickens. Your very family name could mark you. In some towns, entire lineages of executioners were labeled, tracked, and sometimes even barred from entering churches, bakeries, or public baths. Hygiene and salvation were not for you. But, on the other hand, there were some benefits. You would likely never be bullied too severely. No one wanted to pick a fight with the executioner's son. The fear surrounding your family was very real. You might not be well-liked, but you would be respected in the same way that people respect a thunderstorm or a very sharp knife. So, welcome to your life. You did not ask for it, but it is yours now, and it will be forever. So you have just been born. Hooray. A bouncing baby, a bundle of joy, swaddled in wool, baptized in holy water, and immediately burdened with generations of trauma. You are the newest member of an executioner's family, medieval society's most essential yet least welcome profession. While other children are fated to churn butter or one day inherit a sheep farm, you have been born into the one job that ensures everyone will avoid you like a person coughing during a plague year. Your future is determined. Sharp metal, public spectacles, and a lifetime of being the person no one makes eye contact with, even when you are only 6 years old. And no, you do not get a choice in the matter. Being an executioner is not something you can apply for. There is no medieval job fair with a booth that says, "Do you love justice? Do you hate being popular? Inquire within." If your dad swung the axe, then guess what? You will be swinging it once you hit puberty. Even as a toddler, the villagers whisper when you walk past. You have not even performed your first decapitation, and you are already treated as if you bite livestock. The blacksmith's child gets offered candy, You get suspicious looks and an empty space in the church pews. That is, if you are even permitted to enter the church. And what about family dinners? They are less. How was your day? And more. Did you remember to oil the chain on the gallows? Your bedtime stories do not have dragons, unless those dragons are being hanged for heresy. Your toys include miniature scaffolds. Your version of hide and seek usually ends with other people hiding and then never coming back. You can't even marry your way out of it. Most respectable families will not allow their daughters within 5 feet of you, let alone let them approach the altar. This is probably for the best, since your family name has been whispered like a curse word for the past 3 generations. That is Carl's boy, the one who swung too deep last winter. And sure, there are some perks. No one bullies the executioner's son. Even the local tough guy does not want to end up as your practice. You develop a strong back, a steady hand, and a deadpan expression that gets you out of most social gatherings, which is helpful because you are never invited to them anyway. So there you have it. You are not just born. You are branded. You did not choose the axe life. The axe life chose you, and it has no intention of letting you go. By the time you are old enough to grow a beard or swing a training axe, you have already come to terms with one fundamental truth. The town needs you, but they would prefer it if you stayed out of sight, ideally behind a curtain, over a hill, or behind a moral veil of plausible deniability. As a medieval executioner, you are society's living paradox. You perform the work that no one else dares to do. And for that, you are rewarded with silence, suspicion, and the occasional terrified blessing from a distance of 10 feet. People speak to you as if you are a haunted well, useful in a crisis, but deeply unsettling the rest of the time. Do they need someone to be publicly disemboweled? The town calls upon you. Do they need someone to invite to their daughter's wedding feast? Not a chance. You are the final answer to every problem the sheriff does not want on his conscience. And yet, once the deed is done and the head has rolled into the hay, everyone suddenly remembers that they have somewhere else they need to be, which is usually anywhere that is not next to you. In the court records, you are referred to as the Blade of Justice. In the tavern gossip, you are that creepy fellow who probably talks to skulls. You could save a child from drowning, and someone would still whisper, "Yes, but how many people has he cut in half?" To them, you represent both punishment and paranoia, a stark reminder that the law has teeth, and those teeth are big, sharp, and very public. And let's not pretend that it is only the peasants who feel this way. Even the nobles turn up their noses at you. They will pay you in silver and congratulate themselves for upholding justice, but you will never be invited to dine in their halls, unless it is to demonstrate the proper form for swinging an axe between courses. And best of all, if something goes wrong, let's say you botch an execution or someone gets squeamish in the middle of a torture session, it is your head that is on the proverbial and possibly literal chopping block. The same crowd that cheered for your last performance will turn on you faster than a frightened chicken. You are not a man. You are a tool, and everyone pretends that you do not exist unless they need something to be violently removed. So yes, the town needs you, but they would much rather you came in through the back door, wore a hood, and left before the sun came up. While other boys are learning how to plow fields, shoe horses, or, if they are particularly blessed, how to read, your education is a bit more specialized. You are not studying scripture or learning sewing techniques. You are learning how to sever a spine in one clean stroke. Welcome to your childhood apprenticeship, where precision is not optional, and where failure does not just cost lives, it ruins your reputation before you have even had a chance to build one. Your father, or some other grizzled, older executioner with arms like tree trunks, teaches you the sacred art of not messing up in front of a crowd. Because while everyone might pretend that they hate what you do, they will absolutely judge your form, your footwork, and your follow-through as if it were the medieval Olympics. Your curriculum includes chopping techniques, because missing the neck by even an inch can turn justice into a morbid comedy show. You study anatomy, because you need to know which bones are the easiest to break and which ones will make your axe bounce back in a moment of public humiliation. And you learn about stage presence, because let's face it, every execution is a public performance. You are the final act, the main event, the reason that people leave their farms and bring their children to the town square. Think of it as dinner theater, but instead of dessert, there is dismemberment. There is no practice dummy. unless you count the occasional pig carcass or a particularly unlucky rebel. Most of what you learn on the job. And let's be honest, everyone remembers your first time, especially if it does not go well, especially if you freeze or shake or, heaven forbid, take more than one swing. Nothing will haunt you like the memory of a half-beheaded criminal and an impatient crowd. You are trained to be calm, efficient, and unshakable, but no one teaches you how to cope with the psychological toll. There is no medieval HR department, no stress leave, and no self-care scroll-on. How to not think about severed heads. You just sharpen your blade, swallow your guilt, and get ready for the next performance. And what do you get in return for your finely honed, lethal expertise? Not admiration, not gratitude, but silence. Maybe you get a few extra coins and the lingering stench of death on your clothes and in your soul. You are not just trained to kill, you are trained to carry the weight of it all quietly. Picture this. It is a sunny morning. The market square is bustling with activity. Bakers are selling bread that smells vaguely edible. Blacksmiths are banging away with impressive confidence. And the butcher is enthusiastically waving a cleaver. Everyone is shouting prices, gossiping, and living their little medieval lives. Then you show up. The crowd parts as if you are carrying the plague in one hand and a severed head in the other. And to be fair, sometimes you are. But even when you are just there to buy some turnips, people scatter like rats fleeing from a torch. You see, executioners were often forbidden or heavily discouraged from even entering public markets. In some towns, you had to wait until after hours to purchase food. In others, you had your own special corner of shame where the vendors would leave your goods out for you to collect, like a cursed medieval version of DoorDash. And why was this? Because apparently, the man who handles legal killings is somehow too unclean to touch a radish. If you dared to mingle with the regular folks, things got awkward very quickly. Merchants would take your coins with a pair of tongs or, even worse, refuse them altogether. You could be holding clean silver, and they would act as if you had handed them a live scorpion that had been dipped in guilt. "Oh no, not from you, good sir. We are, out of cabbage today." Children would be yanked away. People would make the sign of the cross. One particularly dramatic fishwife would spit every time you walked by, not directly at you, but just close enough to make her feelings perfectly clear. Touching the goods was a risky business. If you picked up a loaf of bread, no one else would want it. If you so much as grazed the apples, that entire crate might be dumped into a ditch out of sheer spiritual panic. One brush from your cursed executioner's fingers, and the produce went from farmed to forbidden. Eventually, most executioners learned to send someone else to do their shopping if they could. A relative, a bribed servant, or anyone with a less unsettling aura. Someone whose hands did not smell faintly of burning justice. And so you would retreat again, back to your lonely dwelling, your private food supply, and your increasingly antisocial lifestyle. Because even when you were off the clock, the town still remembered who you were. And they would really prefer it if you did not touch the cheese. Congratulations, you have your own place. Unfortunately, it is not located in town. It is not even close. Your new address is somewhere beyond the northern gate, past the gallows and next to the wild boars. As a medieval executioner, you do not just get the cold shoulder, you get a full-on banishment by zoning law. You are not allowed to live inside the city walls with the normal people. Instead, your home is somewhere between a hermit's hut and a haunted outpost. You are less of a village member and more of an unpleasant forest NPC. There is a reason for this, of course, a combination of superstition, religion, and good old-fashioned hypocrisy. The same people who hire you to swing an axe at 10 o'clock in the morning do not want to risk your allegedly cursed energy wafting through their neighborhood by 6 o'clock in the evening. Your house is usually located near the execution grounds because that is considered convenient. Convenient for whom, exactly, remains unclear. It is certainly not convenient for you. You live in the shadow of your work, quite literally. The gallows are creaking in the wind, and the crows are eyeing you as if you are next. Sometimes, there are still corpses hanging in view of your breakfast table. Bon appetit. The place itself? It is yours, technically. It is a gift from the city, which is the medieval way of saying, We dumped some lumber in a field and said good luck. It is drafty, damp, and wonderfully secluded. Your home might be the only one in Christendom with a doormat that says, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." This is not for your visitors, but for your own self-esteem. You have no neighbors, no casual strolls through the neighborhood, and no visiting merchants or passing monks. It is just you, your tools, and the occasional raccoon with no sense of personal space. You might hear the church bells in the distance, but you will not hear the laughter of the marketplace. You are close enough to serve the town, but you are far enough away to never truly belong to it. And when the storms roll in, who rushes to check on you? No one. The town forgets that you exist until the next criminal needs a very final solution. So there you live, outside the walls, a man apart, visible only when your presence is required. Like thunder, ominous, functional, and best appreciated from a distance. So you are an executioner. You live outside the walls. Your handshake is treated like a biohazard, and your trips to the grocery store require a great deal of diplomatic finesse. But surely you can find some comfort in your family, right? Well, here is the thing, medieval executioners did have families. They just had a very hard time starting them. You see, once your occupation becomes known, your dating prospects plummet faster than a heretic falling through a trapdoor. No one wants to marry the guy whose job description includes the phrase, "Clean up arterial spray." Respectable families lock their doors when you walk by. Fathers hold their daughters a little closer. Even the town drunk, who once proposed to a goat, looks at you and says, "That's a bit much, don't you think?" So your dating pool ends up being very shallow. Extremely shallow. Often, the only people who are willing to marry executioners are other outcasts. Gravediggers, knackers, lepers, or, if you are lucky, widows whose standards have taken some serious structural damage. Romantic, candlelit dinners? Try having conversations that are whispered in alleys so that no one sees her talking to you. And if you do manage to get married and have children, they inherit your profession like a curse that is sewn into their skin. Your sons are trained from a young age to swing steel with surgical precision. And your daughters, well, they carry your name, which is usually enough to get them socially exiled by the time they are 6 years old. It is not so much a family as it is a legally necessary support staff. Your family cannot attend festivals, they cannot walk through town together, and they cannot pretend to be normal for even a single Sunday. If they do go to church, they have to sit in the back or they do not go at all. Because even salvation has its boundaries. And over time, that isolation takes a toll. You love your children, of course, but you are also passing on to them a future that smells like blood and loneliness. The family tree does not grow. It just repeats itself. The same job, the same shame, the same invisible wall between you and the rest of humanity. There are no proud family portraits, no family crests, just a long line of people who wore hoods not to hide their faces, but because the world never wanted to see them in the first place. So you have done your duties literally all week. You have lopped off heads, you have disemboweled a heretic or two, and you have maybe even cleaned your blade with holy water out of sheer anxiety. Surely, it is time to confess your sins, right? You can light a candle, say a prayer, and start fresh. Well, not quite. In the eyes of the medieval church, you are somewhere between a necessary evil and a walking contradiction. Yes, you enforce divine justice. Yes, you serve the state and you uphold law and order. But also, and this is an important point, you kill people for a living, which inconveniently is a sin. And so, despite doing God's dirty work, you are not exactly welcome in his house. Many executioners were outright denied confession. Some priests simply would not listen. Others insisted that you undergo a ritual cleansing before you could step inside the church, which is tricky, because no amount of soap can wash away a reputation. And do not even think about receiving Holy Communion. That was reserved for those with clean souls. Yours is more of a permanent stain. It is a cruel irony. You kill people with the approval of the state, yet spiritually, you are treated like a man who strangles kittens for fun. Even lepers, who at least had a medical excuse for their condition, were often treated with more compassion. Weddings? Not in the church. Christenings? Maybe, if the priest is having a generous day and half the town is not glaring at him. Funerals? Do not count on it. Some executioners were not even buried in consecrated ground. They were put in the ditch outside the cemetery walls. Prime real estate for exiles, suicides, and people who forgot to pay their tithes. So where does that leave you spiritually? Nowhere comforting. You spend your life surrounded by death, and yet you have no path to forgiveness. You cannot unburden yourself. You cannot cry to a friar or light a votive candle for your sins. Instead, you carry them quietly and heavily. Sometimes you drink. Sometimes you scream into the woods. Sometimes you just sharpen your blade again. Even when you believe that you are doing the right thing, when the law is clear and the trial was fair, you still go home unsure of whether you are damned by man, by God, or by both. Because even in a world where everyone sins, you are the one who has made a profession out of it. There is nothing quite like the pressure of performing an execution in front of a screaming crowd. It is part justice, part ritual, and part public entertainment, and you are the main act. You have to forget about your nerves. You have to forget about the bad weather. The crowd does not care if your wrist hurts, if your stomach is empty, or if your axe is a little dull from last week's double hanging. They came to see a show. And you are the one holding the spotlight and the blade. The goal is simple, one clean swing. A fast, clean beheading is the gold standard. Anything less than that, and the murmurs begin. If you miss by an inch, the crowd gasps. If you take a second swing, they groan. A third? Now they are booing. One of the kids has just started crying. Someone throws an onion. And let's be honest, you feel it too. The shame, the failure, the victim still twitching on the block, the blood spurting in the wrong direction, your boots sticky with regret. You were not trained for this part. The psychological shrapnel that comes from turning someone's last moment into a civic embarrassment. Sometimes the axe gets caught in a bone. Sometimes the condemned person jerks at the last second. Sometimes your hand just slips. And in those moments, your entire reputation and possibly your job hangs in the balance. Because here is the thing. No one cares how hard the job is. They just want it to look easy. Executioners are supposed to be clinical, unemotional, and precise. If you falter, you risk looking weak. And in a world that is obsessed with strength, weakness is contagious. And the rumors spread quickly. He needed 2 swings. His hand was shaking. The guy suffered. You become a cautionary tale that is whispered in the breadlines. Do not end up like that poor soul. Or worse, like the guy who could not even finish the job. So you go home, you scrub your blade, and you relive every mistake, every gasp, and every groan. You replay it in your mind until you are too tired to keep spinning. And even then, it lingers, because in your world, the axe does not just fall on the condemned. It is hovering over you too, every time you step onto that platform. So you have done the deed. The crowd has gasped, gawked, and then dispersed. The condemned person is headless. Justice has been served, and the village square is back to selling cabbage. It is time to pack up and head home, right? Not even close. Being an executioner was not just about swinging an axe. That was the dramatic part, the flashy moment. The rest of it was far messier, far quieter, and far more grotesquely underappreciated, because someone has to deal with the body. And surprise, that someone is you. You might be asked to burn the body, to bury it in unconsecrated ground, or to stuff it into a shallow grave under the gallows, the medieval equivalent of a garbage chute. There is no funeral, no ceremony, just the faint hope that the local dogs will not dig it up. And you do not get any gloves or soap or a break. You are effectively the sanitation department of death, the final cleaner of sin, the silent janitor of justice, and no one ever thanks you. In fact, the very same people who were cheering for the execution now avoid you even more, because you smell like ashen entrails. There are also the side jobs, torture, that is on you. Branding criminals, that is you again. Setting up for public shaming, you are the guy with the hammer and nails. Sometimes, they will even have you flog someone while you are reading scripture aloud, multitasking your way through a moral meltdown. Oh, and if a noble demands discretion, guess who is cleaning up the noble's mess with 0 witnesses and a very real understanding that if anyone talks, they are next. You are an executioner by title, yes, but by function, You are your medieval society's all-purpose horror technician. When the crowds disappear, the priests go silent, and the court scribes head back to their parchment. You are the one who stays behind. You are the one who finishes the job that no one else can stomach. For all the fear, revulsion, and existential dread that is wrapped around your role, being a medieval executioner does come with one undeniable perk. You get paid. In fact, you are often paid more than the average peasant. Sometimes much more. Executions, torture sessions, and dismemberment duties, they all come with a tidy purse of silver. If you add in the bribes you get for extra discretion or for making it quick, you might even find yourself with the kind of money that makes the bakers envious. But here is the catch. You cannot spend it like a normal person. You walk into a tavern with a jingling pouch, and suddenly the room gets very quiet. The barkeep pours your ale, and then he wipes the counter as if your very presence is a stain. You tip him double, he still will not look you in the eye. You go to buy a new tunic, and the tailor hands you the finished product with a pair of tongs. The coins you give him are real, but to him they are cursed. Blood money, he mutters, as if the silver will bite him. And heaven forbid you try to give to charity. One time you tried to donate to the church. They took your donation, and then they used it to pay someone else to clean the holy relics, just in case. Sure, you can accumulate wealth. You might even be able to build a small home with actual furniture, which is a rarity for your class. But the irony is this: the more you earn, the more isolated you become. You are rich, yes, but you are rich like a dragon who is hoarding gold in a cave, alone and feared. People assume that the money makes up for the stigma, that a heavy purse can balance a heavy conscience. But gold does not silence nightmares. It does not scrub the blood from your memory or buy you back your humanity. It just sits there, cold, shiny, and useless for the things that truly matter. You do not buy peace with money in the Middle Ages. You buy silence. You buy space. You buy the right to drink alone at a corner table without being told to leave. And deep down, you know the truth. Every coin that you carry was bought with someone else's last breath. That is the currency of your life. And no amount of it will ever buy you forgiveness. In a town of maybe a few hundred people, everyone knows who you are. They know your name, your house, your footsteps, your job, and most importantly, your shadow. They whisper it. That is him. They murmur it as you pass. The executioner. They pull their children close, as if you might accidentally decapitate someone in the middle of your walk. And yet, despite this widespread recognition, no one really knows you. You could have a favorite song, a cherished childhood memory, or a surprisingly decent hand at wood carving, but that does not matter. Your entire identity is reduced to one role: the blade. People do not see you. They see what you do. You are a living job description. Even when you are off duty, just walking to buy onions, people will cross the street as if you are contagious. No one asks you how you are doing. No one asks if the job weighs on you, because they have already decided that you do not feel anything. To them, you are not a man with doubts or regrets. You are the axe with legs. It is a strange duality. You are known by everyone, yet you are fully understood by no one. You are present in every courtroom sentence, every hushed bedtime story, and every moral lesson that is whispered to misbehaving kids. But you are never really invited into the world that you serve. When you walk into the tavern, the voices get quiet. When you leave, they rise again. You hear laughter, but you are never a part of it. It always happens after you have gone. There is no, "How was your day?" No, "Are you holding up all right?" No, "Do you ever wish it was different?" If you speak too much, you are unsettling. If you say nothing, you are cold. If you smile, that is the worst of all. It is creepy. The man who swings the sword should not be smiling, ever. And so, over time, you play the part. You become the figure that they already believe you are. Grim, silent, and carved from stone. You learn to stand still, to nod, and to fade into the background. Because while everyone in town knows your name, not a single one of them knows you. You are a myth with a pulse, a necessary ghost, familiar in your function, but alien in everything else. After a long day of dismemberment, blood-stained boots, and polite public trauma, you finally return home to your charming little hut outside the walls, surrounded by silence and a slight smell of iron. You take off your cloak, you lay down your axe, you sit on the edge of your straw mattress, and you try to be human again. But the nightmares are already waiting for you. You lie down and you close your eyes. And there they are, the faces. Not heroic, not villainous, just people. Some of them screamed, some of them cried, and some of them mumbled prayers with trembling lips. Some of them looked you straight in the eye as if to say, "You know this is wrong." And the worst ones? The ones who said nothing at all, the calm ones, the resigned ones, the ones who accepted their fate faster than you ever could. You relive every swing. You feel every bone crunch. You hear the gasps of the crowd, their disgust, and their delight. You see the bodies falling in slow motion, like tragic marionettes with their strings cut. There is no escape. Not in your sleep. Not in the silence. Not in a drink. Believe me, you have tried. You start to flinch at everyday sounds. The clatter of firewood, the snap of a rope, the creak of wooden stairs. They are all reminders, all echoes. And you never forget the ones you botched. The blade that hesitated, the cut that went crooked, the moan of someone who was supposed to die faster. You carry that with you. No one checks on you. There is no medieval counselor for post-traumatic decapitation disorder. You do not write letters. You do not cry in public. You just stare into the fire and hope that your soul does not go completely numb before your hands do. Sometimes, late at night, you ask yourself, what if they were innocent? What if justice got it wrong? What if I got it wrong? But you already know that the answer does not matter, because the sentence was passed, the crowd gathered, the axe fell, and the nightmare stayed. You were trained to kill, not to grieve. But your dreams did not get the memo. So you wake up with your fists clenched, your temples aching, and blood that will not wash away, because it is not on your hands anymore. It is in your head. The thing that no one tells you when you become an executioner is this: you do not retire. There is no farewell feast, no pension, and no golden axe that is mounted on a plaque. You just start shaking one day, or you start missing, or you start dreaming too loudly, and the town begins to whisper, not with sympathy, but with concern. Not for you, but for the sake of efficiency. Because to them, you are not a man. You are a mechanism, a moving part in the justice machine. As long as your blade is sharp and your swing is steady, they will nod from a distance and pretend that you do not exist. But the moment you falter, the instant your hands tremble on the block, or you take a second too long with the rope, the machine creaks and they all notice. Suddenly, you are a problem, a liability. Not because your soul is unraveling, but because you are disrupting the spectacle. The crowd did not come to see guilt. They came to see competence. So the town begins its quiet transition. Maybe a younger man, your apprentice, your son, your distant cousin, starts handling the smaller jobs. A flogging here, a branding there, and then a hanging. No one tells you that you have been replaced. You simply start getting fewer summons. The coins slow down. The stares change from fear to a faint pity, the most dangerous kind of pity, because it means that they have stopped needing you. And when you are finally forgotten, it is not by accident. It is by design. You fade away into your cottage outside the walls, with your tools rusting beside you. Your hands, which were once strong and precise, now tremble when you try to lift a spoon. Your knees ache from a lifetime of kneeling at the block, and no one comes to visit. Your name becomes an uncomfortable footnote in the village's memory. Remember old what's his name, the one with the axe? Oh yeah, did not he go mad? And when you finally die, probably alone, the church is still not sure whether they should bury you inside the gate or just leave you under a tree somewhere. Because in the end, you were never a part of the town. You were a service, and services, when they are worn out, are quietly discarded. First, the job made sense. The condemned were thieves, murderers, and heretics. You were the arm of the law, the edge of justice. You did not question it. You executed your duties efficiently, publicly, and without hesitation. But as the years went on and the block grew slick with repetition, something began to itch under the surface of your certainty. Start small. A man is sentenced for stealing a loaf of bread. He had 5 children. He had no defense, just hunger. Then, a woman is accused of witchcraft because she muttered her prayers in the wrong language. You saw the fear in her eyes, the absolute confusion as the noose was slipped over her neck. And then there were the nobles, the ones who ordered deaths not because of guilt, but because of politics, land, jealousy, or the need to make someone disappear. You start to realize that you are not just burying criminals. You are burying secrets. The executioner's block becomes a filter, one that sifts out the inconvenient, the poor, and the powerless. And you are the final stamp, the one who makes it all irreversible. You want to believe in the law, in structure, in right and wrong. But the voices that once declared guilt so confidently now ring hollow. You have heard the crowd cheer as a man screamed. You have seen magistrates exchange glances like merchants who are haggling over a soul. And you were always told, it is not your place to judge. You only carry out the sentence. But what happens when the sentence is wrong? There is no room to ask, no confessional booth, and no forum. You sit alone at night, sharpening your blade, and you wonder how many lives were ended because someone needed a message to be sent. And you cannot say anything, not just because it is dangerous, but because who would listen to you? You are the executioner. No one believes the man who wears the hood. You do not get to have opinions, you get to have orders. So you bury justice one stroke at a time. Not because you want to, but because you have to. Because in this world, truth is a luxury. And you are just the broom that sweeps it under the scaffold. And the worst part? You are starting to think that you were never justice's sword, but just its gravedigger. You spent your life in service. Not to glory, not to gold, and not even to justice. Just to duty, the grim, blood-soaked kind that no one talks about at feasts. And when your end finally comes, it is not dramatic. There are no poetic final words. There is no family gathered at your bedside. Just a cough that does not go away. A slow fade in a straw-stuffed bed that still smells faintly of iron and damp rope. One final breath, and that is it. No bells toll for you. No priest rushes to your side. No one weeps. Your body is found by a local boy. Or maybe it is not found at all until the smell becomes a problem. The town clerk marks your passing in a single sentence, which is scribbled on the back of a tax ledger. Executioner deceased. Replacement pending. There is no funeral procession, no carved headstone, and maybe a wooden marker if someone remembers, but it will not last through the winter. You are not buried in the churchyard, of course. You are laid in the earth outside the gates. The same gates that you were never allowed to pass through in life. Executioners, after all, were unclean, tainted, useful, and disposable. You were the one who buried hundreds of people. And yet, no one truly buries you. The town moves on quickly. There is always another blade, another son, and another poor soul who inherits the job like a curse that is wrapped in tradition. In the years to come, people might speak of you in fragments. The one who beheaded that baron. Remember the one who drank alone and never looked anyone in the eye. Or worse, what was his name again? Your legacy is not stories or children or peace. It is silence. It is absence. It is the space that you filled that no one wants to talk about. And maybe that is fitting. You spent your life making sure the guilty were forgotten. You just did not realize that you would be forgotten with them. So in the end, your death mirrors your life. Necessary, but never mourned. Because in medieval society, you were never meant to be remembered. You were meant to be endured. And now you are finally not. It all started with water that was running through a ditch. On January 24, 1848, a man named James W. Marshall, who was working on the American River near Coloma, California, looked down and saw something strange that was glinting in the sun. At first, he did not believe it. It was just a tiny yellow flake. Could have been fool's gold. But no, it passed the scratch test. It was real gold. Actual gold. He ran to tell his boss, John Sutter, who was less than thrilled. Sutter was not thinking about riches, he was thinking about land. He was building an agricultural empire, and he knew what a gold discovery would mean. Chaos, stampedes of strangers, squatter claims, and the end of his carefully laid dreams. So the two men tried to keep it a secret. Spoiler, they failed miserably. Within weeks, the rumors were spreading like wildfire, literally faster than the mail system. Locals were showing up with pans and pickaxes. People were abandoning their jobs in the middle of their shifts. Sailors were jumping off their ships in San Francisco and disappearing into the hills. The newspapers did not even bother to fact-check. Gold found in California was printed like it was the gospel, and then all hell broke loose. That summer, President Polk confirmed the discovery in a speech to Congress. That was it. The genie was out of the bottle. By 1849, over 90,000 people who were nicknamed the 49ers were pouring into California by land, by sea, and by every miserable route in between. And what had started as one man squinting into a ditch became the largest mass migration in the history of the United States. But here is the thing: Marshall never got rich. Neither did Sutter. The discoverers ended up broke, bitter, and pushed aside as the gold fever that they had unleashed consumed everything. So picture it. One accidental flicker in a muddy trench led to a global stampede, reshaped the map, fueled American expansion, and catapulted California from a sleepy frontier to statehood in just 2 years. And the irony? The men who had found the gold barely got a single nugget. Now that we have set the stage, let's dive deeper into the madness, the migration, and the myths that turned California into the land of golden dreams and broken promises. Imagine that you are a farmer in Ohio or a shopkeeper in Boston in 1849. You hear the whispers, you see the headlines. Gold, mountains of it. It is just lying there for the taking in California. You sell your land, you kiss your family goodbye, and you start walking literally across the country. That is what thousands of people did. And just like that, the age of the 49ers had begun. They came in waves, from every state and from places that were much farther away. Latin Americans, Australians, Europeans, and even a contingent of Chinese miners who braved the treacherous crossing of the Pacific Ocean. Some of them came in covered wagons, and they endured cholera, starvation, and every kind of weather hell that the West could throw at them. Others boarded creaky ships, took a detour through Panama, and hoped that they would not catch yellow fever before they boarded another ship north to San Francisco. And oh, San Francisco! It was a once sleepy port town that had maybe 1,000 residents before the rush. By the end of 1849, over 25,000 people had flooded into the city. It was a surreal transformation. Canvas tents were popping up faster than buildings. Whole ships were abandoned and turned into warehouses, prisons, and hotels. You could walk through the harbor without ever touching the water, just stepping from one deserted ship deck to another. It was not glamorous. Picture mountains of mud, makeshift saloons, overpriced pickaxes, and a real estate market that made Manhattan look like a bargain bin. A single egg might cost you $3. A decent pair of boots? Good luck with that, maybe $100. Inflation was running wild, and scams were more common than gold nuggets. But that did not matter. The dream was enough. The gold fever had its grip on them. Some people struck it rich in a single afternoon. Others dug for years and died penniless. The rivers of the Sierra Nevada became clogged with miners, each one of them swinging a pan and hoping that their next scoop would change everything. This migration changed more than just California. It altered the entire American psyche. Suddenly, hard work was not just noble. It might make you wealthy. Manifest destiny got a shot of adrenaline. California, which had been barely a blip on the map just a year before, was now the promised land. Of course, when thousands of desperate men pile into the same few valleys with shovels, things get tense. So you have made it. You have walked across deserts, you have survived dysentery, and you have maybe even dodged a few bandits. You have reached gold country. Congratulations. Now the real misery begins. Mining was not a glorious treasure hunt. It was backbreaking, soul-crushing labor. Forget about chests that were full of gold coins. This was hours that were spent knee-deep in freezing rivers, swirling pans of gravel, and praying to find a glimmer. Most people did not. For every lucky strike, there were 1,000 empty pans and 10,000 aching backs. In the early days, it was all about placer mining, scooping up gravel from the riverbeds and letting the water do the work. But as the easy gold disappeared, things escalated. Miners turned to rockers, sluices, and eventually to hydraulic mining. a violent process that blasted entire hillsides apart with water cannons. It tore through the land and it poisoned the rivers. But it got results. The camps were chaos. Imagine a rowdy collection of tents, makeshift cabins, and saloons, all of which were stitched together by desperation and mud. Bathing was optional. Food was scarce. Whiskey was not. Violence was simmering just under the surface. Arguments over claims would turn deadly very quickly, especially when no one trusted the courts and everyone had a shovel. And then there was the disease. With thousands of people who were crammed into unsanitary camps, cholera and dysentery were just a part of daily life. If you did not die from the contaminated water, you might die from a poorly cooked squirrel or from an infection that you got from a minor cut. There were no real doctors, just a few medicine men who had more moonshine than they had medical knowledge. To top it all off, the prices were absurd. A shovel that cost $2 in New York could run you $30 in the mines. Eggs were luxury items. Laundry? I hope you enjoyed wearing dirt. And if you did strike it rich, good luck keeping it. Theft was rampant. One moment, you had a pouch of gold dust. The next morning, it was gone, and so was your bunkmate. But somehow, the myth endured. People kept coming. The hope, the gamble, and the raw possibility of it all was enough. Where there was gold, people followed. And where people went, chaos was not far behind. The gold rush did not just create mining camps. It birthed entire towns overnight. Places like Placerville, Marysville, and Deadwood, yes, that Deadwood, exploded in population faster than anyone could control them. They were called boom towns. And the name fit. They would boom into existence and then often collapse just as quickly. These were places that were without laws, without any real government, and often without a moral compass. Judges were rare and sheriffs were even rarer. And the gold? It made men desperate. If you did not stake a good claim, someone might try to steal it. If you did stake a good claim, someone might still try to steal it or just shoot you and take it. Enter the vigilantes. In the towns where the law had not yet arrived or had been paid off, the citizens would often take justice into their own hands. Vigilante groups were formed, sometimes with noble intentions, and other times with pure greed. The trials could be quick, and the sentences could be even quicker. If someone was caught stealing gold or cheating at cards, they might be hanged from the nearest tree without so much as a trial. It was not justice, it was convenience. The saloons were the nerve centers of these towns. Gambling, drinking, brawling, and the occasional accidental gunshot were all a part of the soundtrack. And if you were looking for company, the soiled doves, the women who had followed the rush westward, ran the bordellos, and they would charge a premium for their companionship and would survive in a world that was heavily tilted against them. Still, not everyone was lawless. Many people tried to build real communities. Churches sprang up, schools opened, and newspapers began to circulate. San Francisco even formed a committee of vigilance to root out corruption, and it ended up becoming more powerful than the actual government. One strange detail: gold was not always used for buying things. It was too easy to shave a little off. Instead, people would trade in gold dust, which was literally measured by tiny brass scales that were kept on the bar counter. A pinch might get you a meal, and a full pouch might get you a night that you would not remember. But the boom towns were not built to last. Once the gold dried up, so did the population. Many of the towns were abandoned, and they became ghost towns almost overnight. While the prospectors were chasing their dreams of wealth, others were paying a price that was far higher than gold. The California gold rush was not just a story of fortune. It was also one of displacement, violence, and racial injustice. And the first to suffer were the Native American tribes. The indigenous peoples of California had lived in the region for thousands of years. But once the rush began, they were driven from their lands with a brutal speed. The forests were cut down, the rivers were poisoned by mercury and sediment, and the hunting grounds were taken over by the miners and the boomtowns. Some of the tribes were forced into servitude under the guise of apprenticeships. Others were outright massacred. State-sanctioned militia campaigns were even funded to remove the native populations. It was nothing short of a disaster. In just 2 decades, the native population of California plummeted by nearly 90%. And then came the waves of immigrants, especially the Chinese. By the early 1850s, tens of thousands of Chinese laborers had arrived in California. Most of them had intended to work, earn some money, and send it back home to their families. But what they got instead was suspicion, racism, and harsh taxes. In 1850, California passed a foreign miners tax, which specifically targeted the Chinese. They were banned from owning land, from testifying against white men in court, and from mining without paying fees that were at an extortion level. Yet, despite these barriers, many of the Chinese miners endured. They formed tight-knit communities, they reworked abandoned claims, and they even built the backbone of the future infrastructure, laying the tracks for the Transcontinental Railroad. Just a few years later, the Mexican and Latin American miners were also pushed out, and often violently. Despite having legitimate claims and gold mining experience, they were hounded out of the towns. They were labeled greasers, and they were stripped of their rights. And the African Americans, both free and enslaved individuals, came west in search of opportunity. Some of them did find it, and they established businesses, farms, and even newspapers. But the racial lines were always shifting, and the promise of freedom came with no guarantees. Slavery was not legal in California, but loopholes were exploited by the Southern slaveholders who brought their enslaved people with them under other names. The gold rush transformed America, but it also revealed its deepest contradictions. It was a land of opportunity, yes, but it was only for some. Gold did not just glitter. It greased the gears of a transforming nation. The California gold rush injected a seismic jolt into the U.S. economy. By 1852, the gold exports from California totaled over $80 million. That is billions in today's dollars. That kind of influx does not just fill up pockets. It fills up banks, it backs up currencies, and it fuels industries. Suddenly, California was not a sleepy western frontier. It was the epicenter of the nation's attention, wealth, and ambition. But there was one big problem. California was not a state. It was not even an organized territory in the traditional sense. It had been acquired in 1848 after the Mexican-American War, but the governance was a mess. The sudden flood of settlers made it clear that something had to be done, and it had to be done fast. So in 1850, just 2 years after the first gold nugget had been found, California became the 31st state. That is warp speed for U.S. expansion. And unlike many of the other Western territories, it bypassed the awkward adolescent years as a territory, and it went straight to statehood with no waiting in line. But there was a catch. California was admitted as a free state, which meant that it banned slavery. This sent the already fragile balance between the free and the slave states into a tailspin. The South was furious. The North was energized. And the political tension pushed the nation one step closer to a civil war. Meanwhile, back in California, the wealth kept flowing. And it was not just from the gold. The entrepreneurs realized that the miners were the real gold mine. A German immigrant named Levi Strauss began selling tough canvas pants that the miners could not tear through, and he invented blue jeans. Leland Stanford sold supplies to the miners before he went on to help build the Transcontinental Railroad and found Stanford University. That railroad, by the way, became the artery that connected California's gold to the eastern markets. Before the railroads, it took months to reach California by land or by sea. With the trains, it was a matter of days. The gold rush did not just spark economic growth. It sparked infrastructure, commerce, and a boom in Western migration. And while California grew richer and more connected, the U.S. realized something else. Whoever controlled the West might just control the future. If the gold rush turned men into legends, it also turned landscapes into battlegrounds. The earliest mining efforts were relatively low impact. They used pans, shovels, and maybe a rocker box along a riverbank. But as the surface gold ran out, the miners turned to more aggressive methods. That is when things got ugly. By the mid-1850s, hydraulic mining had arrived. Picture this: massive nozzles that were called monitors would shoot water with enough pressure to blast entire hillsides apart. Entire mountains were turned into a mud slurry in the hunt for tiny flakes of gold. It was fast, it was efficient, and it was utterly devastating. The trees were flattened. The hills disappeared. The rivers ran brown for miles. The sediment from the hydraulic mining clogged up the riverbeds and it flooded the farmlands. The once fertile Central Valley began to drown under tons of mining debris. The Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers overflowed, not just from the rainfall, but from the unnatural buildup of the displaced earth. The crops died. The towns flooded. The fish populations collapsed. It was not mining. It was slow-motion environmental warfare. The miners also used mercury to help them separate the gold from the sediment. It worked, but the mercury did not just disappear. It seeped into the soil, it flowed downstream, and it poisoned the ecosystems. To this day, the mercury from the gold rush era is still found in California's waterways, nearly 2 centuries later. Eventually, the destruction became impossible to ignore. In the 1880s, a group of Central Valley farmers sued a hydraulic mining company in a case that became a national landmark. Woodruff v. North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company. The farmers won, and in 1884, hydraulic mining was effectively banned. It was the first major environmental ruling in the history of the United States. But the damage had already been done. The California landscape had been reshaped, and sometimes beyond recognition. The forests had turned into barren mudflats. The hills had been hollowed out and they never recovered. The rivers had been rerouted. The ecosystems had been upended. And yet, the gold rush also sparked the beginning of America's environmental conscience. As people saw the toll, voices began to rise, and they called for balance, for responsibility, and for the protection of the land. These were the seeds that decades later would grow into the national parks and the conservation movements. The gold rush built dreams, yes, but it also left scars. By the late 1850s, the richest gold veins had been tapped. The boom towns began to empty, and the pickaxes were traded in for plows, pens, and printing presses. But the gold rush was not fading. It was transforming. What had started as a chaotic scramble became a powerful cultural myth. The California gold rush etched itself into the American imagination as a story of adventure, freedom, and reinvention. The newspapers would spin tales of lucky strikes and overnight millionaires, while the dime novels would turn the grubby prospectors into the rugged heroes of the West. Of course, the reality was much messier, but myths rarely need facts. The prospector became an American icon, a weathered hat, a long beard, and a gold pan in his hand. Never mind that most of the real miners were broken, broke, or buried in shallow graves. The image stuck. California became synonymous with opportunity. The American dream suddenly had a location. Even the phrases that we still use today were born in this gold-soaked era. Striking it rich, panning for gold, and yes, even the mother lode. They all echo the lingo of the 1850s mining camps. And let's not forget the iconic Levi's jeans, which were born from the rugged needs of the miners and were eventually adopted by the world. The cities like San Francisco leaned into the legend. What had once been a lawless port now rebranded itself as a gateway to success. The tourism pamphlets would speak of gold country, and the old mining towns would begin to stage festivals, reenactments, and parades that celebrated a time that had nearly broken them. The gold rush also deeply influenced American cinema. The westerns would romanticize the lone miner with a heart of gold, who was fending off the claim jumpers and wooing the saloon girls. It was not accurate, but it sold tickets and it helped to cement the frontier myth in the popular culture. But under the glamorized legends lay the harder truths of the environmental damage, the racial exclusion, and the lives that were lost in the pursuit of the fleeting glitter. Still, the dream endured, and perhaps that was the point. Because the gold rush was not just about wealth. It was about hope, the belief that if you were brave or lucky or stubborn enough, you could change your life with a shovel and some grit. The California gold rush officially ended in 1855, but its impact never really stopped. California, which was once a remote Mexican frontier, had become a powerhouse. Within just a few years, it had gained statehood, it had reshaped America's economy, and it had attracted people from every continent. But more than that, it had become a symbol of reinvention, of ambition, and of what might still be buried just under the surface. The population surge did not just bring the gold hunters. It brought builders, teachers, merchants, and dreamers. The former miners started farms, businesses, and newspapers. The infrastructure that was built for the gold was repurposed for growth. The roads turned into trade routes, the camps into cities, and the shacks into homes. San Francisco went from a mud-soaked outpost to a thriving metropolis practically overnight. And the gold rush did not just leave physical scars. It left an emotional blueprint. That same gamble it all attitude would later fuel the rise of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and the counterculture movements. Whether it was celluloid, silicon, or psychedelics, the idea was the same. Come west, try something wild, and maybe, just maybe, you'll strike gold. Even the tech boom of the late 20th and early 21st centuries echoes the spirit of '49. The young entrepreneurs who were fueled by belief in caffeine would rush into California with nothing but a laptop and a dream. It is not so different from those dusty miners with their pickaxes and their high hopes. But the gold rush also reminds us of what ambition can cost. The native communities were decimated, the ecosystems were disrupted, and the inequality was baked into the economy from the very start. For every lucky strike, there were hundreds who were left behind and forgotten in the footnotes. Today, the remnants of that era still, the landscape, the ghost towns, the rusted mining equipment, and the winding trails through the Sierra Nevada. The museums preserve the artifacts, the schools teach the legends, and the tourism boards sell the fantasy. But the deeper legacy lies in the psyche. The gold rush gave America a permanent sense of urgency. The idea that something bigger, better, and richer is always out there. All you have to do is chase it. So when you hear the phrase, California Dream, remember that it started with a shimmer in the dirt and 1,000 men who were willing to risk everything for a shot at something more. Long before anyone carved laws into stone or inked treaties onto papyrus, trade was already shaping the ancient world. It began not with maps or merchants, but with footsteps, the worn tracks across the hills and the valleys that were trodden by prehistoric peoples in search of what they lacked. Long before the Silk Road, the Amber Road, or the Spice Route, there were the trails of salt, stone, and survival. Imagine a time before writing, before cities, when humans lived in scattered tribal groups, and they would barter their goods out of necessity. One village had flint, another had shells, and a third had access to salt, a precious preservative in a world without refrigeration. Somehow, those items moved, and they were traded hand to hand, tribe to tribe, across a vast and difficult terrain. And the evidence is clear. Obsidian from Anatolia shows up in the Neolithic dig sites hundreds of miles away. Baltic amber turns up in the graves as far south as Mycenaean Greece. Someone, long before there were borders and bureaucracy, was moving these goods. These first trade routes were not carved or engineered. They were organic, and they were dictated by nature. The rivers became highways, the mountain passes became corridors, and the forest trails became lifelines. And with each passing generation, these paths grew more defined. The hunters became traders, and the traders became messengers, and they would carry not only goods but also gossip, stories, and even early religious ideas. Trade was not just about objects, it was about knowledge. It was how farming techniques, metallurgical skills, and even early artistic styles would spread between the cultures. A tribe that learned how to smelt copper from another might change its entire way of life. A decorative motif that was shared through traded pottery might inspire a whole new artistic tradition. These exchanges were slow, and they would often span generations, but they were revolutionary. And all of this happened before writing existed. The legacy of these early routes lies in their persistence. Many of the later trade roads, like parts of the Silk Road or the Arabian incense trails, would follow the same general paths that were first used by the prehistoric traders. These invisible highways were the nervous system of early human connection, a web of trails that wove the world together long before anyone had ever drawn a map. By 3000 BCE, the scattered barter trails of prehistory had evolved into something more sophisticated, a structured commerce between cities, kingdoms, and eventually empires. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. It is often called the cradle of civilization, and it was also the cradle of ancient commerce. The Sumerians, and later the Akkadians and the Babylonians, were not just farmers and builders. They were traders, and they knew the value of keeping records. Around this time, they developed cuneiform, which was one of the earliest known writing systems. At first, it was used to track goods. How much grain was traded, how many goats were exchanged, and what quantity of beer was delivered to the temple storehouse. In other words, writing was born out of the need to manage trade. These Mesopotamian cities did not have everything that they needed, so trade became essential. They would import timber from the Levant, copper from Oman, tin from Iran, and precious stones like lapis lazuli from what is now Afghanistan. In return, they would export textiles, grain, oil, and intricately crafted goods. The merchants who facilitated this trade were not adventurers. They were professionals, and they were often backed by temples or royal houses, with contracts, ledgers, and risk-sharing agreements. Mesopotamia's trade routes extended overland and along the waterways. The Euphrates and the Tigris served as the main arteries, with barges that would ferry the goods between cities like Uruk, and Babylon. The overland caravans of donkeys would carry the goods north to Anatolia or east toward Elam. Trade was not just economic, it was political. Alliances were forged through the exchange. Kings would send gifts to secure peace, and the merchants would act as informal diplomats, and they would carry messages between the distant lands. The concept of a merchant class began to emerge. These were not nobles, priests, or warriors. They were specialists in negotiation, risk, and logistics, and they wielded real influence. In time, their presence became essential to the stability of these early urban economies. Mesopotamia showed that trade could bind cities together, it could create wealth, and it could drive innovation. It transformed the exchange from a necessity to a system, and from handshakes to contracts. While the Mesopotamian merchants ruled the rivers and the overland routes of the Near East, another civilization rose to dominate the seas, the Phoenicians. By 1200 BCE, these master sailors from the Levantine coast, modern-day Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Israel had transformed the Mediterranean into one of history's most active maritime trade networks. The Phoenicians did not build empires through conquest. They built them through commerce. Their city-states, which were notably Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, were small but fiercely independent, and they shared a common gift, the sea. With narrow strips of land and limited agriculture, these cities turned to the waves for their survival. And they did more than just survive. They thrived. The Phoenician ships were fast, they were durable, and they were ahead of their time. They pioneered the use of biremes, ships that had 2 rows of oars, which made long-distance sea travel more efficient and reliable. These vessels would crisscross the Mediterranean, and they would trade everything from timber and glass to the famed Tyrian purple dye, which was extracted from sea snails and was worth its weight in gold. But perhaps their most lasting legacy was what they carried along with their cargo: the alphabet. The Phoenician writing system, with its 22 consonantal letters, would go on to inspire the Greek, the Latin, the Arabic, and the Hebrew scripts, the backbone of modern written communication. They established trading posts from Cyprus to Carthage, and from Sicily to southern Spain. Carthage itself, which would later become Rome's fiercest rival, started as a humble Phoenician outpost. These coastal colonies created a commercial network that rivaled any terrestrial empire. And the Phoenician trade was not just about moving goods, it was about cultural diffusion. Through their interactions, they would spread technologies, religious practices, and art styles across 3 continents. The Egyptian scarabs ended up in the Iberian graves. The Babylonian cylinder seals were found in the Greek islands. A web of connection grew, and it was tied not by blood or by blade, but by trade. Yet for all of their influence, the Phoenicians left behind few monumental ruins. Their legacy is quieter, and it is found in the shipwrecks, the scattered pottery, and the alphabets that we still use today. As the seafarers like the Phoenicians transformed the Mediterranean into a commercial superhighway, another equally vital network was thriving far from the coast. It was across the vast deserts of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. These were the trade routes of the camel caravans, the ancient highways that were etched into the sand where survival was earned mile by mile. The desert may seem like a barrier, but for the ancient traders, it was a corridor. Long before there were paved roads, the camel caravans connected sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa, the Levant, and Arabia. These routes moved gold, salt, frankincense, myrrh, ivory, slaves, and stories. The camel, which is famously known as the ship of the desert, made it all possible. It was domesticated around 1000 BCE, and the dromedary camel could endure the scorching heat. It could travel for days without water, and it could carry loads of up to 600 pounds. In North Africa, the trans-Saharan trade routes flourished between kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai. These were not barren wastelands. They were networks of oases, market towns, and fortified caravanserais where the traders would rest. They would water their camels, and they would exchange their goods under the starlit skies. The gold from the Niger River basin would travel north, and it was often traded weight for weight with salt, which was a vital resource in the tropics. The salt from the Sahara was cut into massive blocks and it was transported south, and it formed the backbone of the empires. Meanwhile, in Arabia, the incense trade was booming. Frankincense and myrrh, which were harvested in southern Arabia, modern Yemen and Oman, were highly prized in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome for their use in temples, in medicine, and in burials. The caravans would traverse the Arabian desert along routes like the Incense Road, and they would stop at cities such as Petra and Mecca long before the rise of Islam. These were not quick trips. Some of the caravans would take months or even years. The traders would face sandstorms, bandits, and extreme dehydration. But the rewards were enormous. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Ubar grew rich and influential, and they served as hubs of wealth, culture, and learning. What the desert trade lacked in monuments, it made up for in resilience. These routes connected continents, empires, and faiths. They stitched together Africa, Arabia, and beyond, one hoofprint at a time. No ancient trade network captured the imagination or reshaped the world quite like the Silk Road. It spanned over 4,000 miles from China to the Mediterranean, and it was not a single road but a tangled web of caravan trails, mountain passes, and river crossings that wove together the destinies of entire civilizations. It began in earnest during the Han Dynasty, which was around the 2nd century BCE, when the Chinese Emperor Wu sent his envoy Zhang Qian westward in search of allies. What he found instead was opportunity, the discovery that the distant peoples were eager for China's most luxurious export, silk. It was lightweight, it was durable, and it was practically glowing, and silk became a sensation across Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Rome, where the senators would pay fortunes to wear it and then nervously declare it to be decadent and dangerous. But silk was just the beginning. The East met the West in the form of goods, ideas, and even diseases. From China came porcelain, tea, and paper. From India came spices, gemstones, and Buddhism. Persia offered carpets, glassware, and horses. Rome and later Byzantium exported wine, olive oil, and fine metalwork. Every link in the chain brought something new, and it received something unexpected. The road itself was brutal. The traders would cross scorching deserts like the Taklamakan, and they would climb the icy peaks in the Pamirs. The bandits would lurk at every pass, and the merchants would rarely make the full journey. Instead, the goods would change hands dozens of times, and they would be passed along like whispers through the markets and the caravanserais. The cultural exchange flourished alongside the commerce. The monks, the missionaries, and the musicians would travel these paths, and they would spread philosophies and fables. The Silk Road did not just carry merchandise. It transported mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and art. The spread of Buddhism from India into China and beyond is one of the Silk Road's most profound legacies. The cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, and Dunhuang became cosmopolitan centers where the languages would mix and the temples would stand side by side. The entire empires would rise and fall around, controlling the key stretches of the route, from the Parthians to the Sogdians to the Mongols. And then came the Black Death, which was likely carried along these same routes in the 14th century, and it grimly reminded the world that trade also moves what we cannot see. While the Silk Road carried the caravans across the mountains and the deserts, the Indian Ocean offered a liquid superhighway, one that was faster, it was cheaper, and in many ways it was even more influential. By 1000 BCE, the Indian Ocean Trade Network was already humming with activity, and it connected East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China in a vast web of commerce and culture. Unlike the chaotic unpredictability of the land routes, the Indian Ocean had a rhythm, the monsoons. These seasonal winds were predictable, one direction in the summer and the opposite in the winter. The skilled sailors learned to ride these wind cycles, which allowed for planned round trips across the vast distances. Thanks to the monsoon system, a merchant ship could sail from East Africa to India, it could load up with goods, and it could return months later with time to spare. What did they carry? Everything. From India, black pepper, cotton textiles, ivory carvings, and later sugar and indigo. From Arabia, frankincense, myrrh, horses, and dates. East Africa offered gold, slaves, and exotic animal products. Southeast Asia traded in spices, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon that were so valuable that they could be worth more than gold per ounce. This was not just about the raw materials, it was about the ideas. Islam spread rapidly along these maritime routes, not by conquest, but by commerce. The Muslim merchants established communities in the Indian ports, on the Swahili coast, and as far east as Indonesia. The local rulers would often convert for an economic advantage, and they would embed religion into the trade. The ports like Calicut, Zanzibar, and Malacca became multi-ethnic melting pots. You could hear Arabic, Tamil, Swahili, and Chinese spoken in a single market. These were not backwaters. They were global hubs centuries before globalization became a buzzword. The ship technology also advanced rapidly. The dhow, with its distinctive triangular sail, became the vessel of choice. It was agile and fast. The Chinese junks, which were massive ships with multiple decks and watertight compartments, later joined the mix, especially during the voyages of Admiral Zhang He in the 15th century. What made the Indian Ocean trade special was not just its scale, but its collaboration. Unlike the territorial empires on the land, the sea trade relied more on mutual benefit than on brute force, at least until the later European intervention. As the trade routes matured, the powerful empires began to realize something crucial. To control the road meant to control the wealth. From the Persian royal road to Rome's stone highways to the mountainous trails of the Inca Empire, these overland routes became tools not just of commerce, but of dominance, diplomacy, and statecraft. Let's start with the Achaemenid Persians. By the 5th century BCE, their royal road stretched over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis. It was the logistical backbone of their empire, and it allowed the messengers, the soldiers, and the merchants to move rapidly across 3 continents. The stations were placed every few miles with fresh horses and guards. A royal courier could cover the entire road in just over a week, which was unheard of for the time. And along with the messages, the merchants would flow too, and they would pay the tolls that filled the imperial coffers. Next came Rome, whose obsession with roads was legendary. "All roads lead to Rome" was not just a saying, it was a policy. The Roman roads were feats of engineering, and they were laid with stone. They were cambered for drainage, and they were marked by milestones. The Appian Way, which was begun in 312 BCE, connected Rome to southern Italy, and it became the prototype for a network that eventually spanned over 250,000 miles. These roads allowed for a fast troop deployment, a tax collection, and, yes, a trade. The goods from the provinces would flow into the heart of the empire. The Egyptian grain, the Spanish silver, the Syrian glass, and the African ivory. Far across the ocean, another road empire flourished. The Incas. Without wheels or horses, they built one of the most astonishing road systems in the world. The Capacnan, or the Inca Road, spanned over 24,000 miles through the Andes. It linked the empire's mountainous spine from Colombia to Chile. The runners, who were called chasquis, would relay messages and small goods across the suspension bridges and the steep cliffs. The Incas used llamas for transport, and they imposed a strict control over who could use the road, which ensured the state's dominance over the trade. In all of these empires, the roads were not just about movement. They were about control. They allowed the rulers to project their power, to enforce their taxation, and to regulate their commerce. The traders would use them, but always at the pleasure of the state. By the fall of Rome and the rise of the medieval kingdoms, many of the ancient trade routes had decayed or had been abandoned. Yet the desire for connection and for profit never disappeared. In fact, the medieval period saw the old routes revived and the new ones forged by a surprising cast of characters. The religious pilgrims, the crusaders, the merchant guilds, and the ambitious city-states. Religion was a powerful motivator. The pilgrimage routes across Europe, like the Camino de Santiago, became the arteries of movement. The pilgrims were not just carrying their faith. They were carrying money, supplies, stories, and even new ideas. The inns, the markets, and the towns grew along these sacred paths, and the local economies boomed. The spiritual devotion kept the people moving, and the commerce followed. Meanwhile, the Islamic empires to the east were thriving. The Abbasid Caliphate transformed the cities like Baghdad and Damascus into glittering trade centers. The Muslim merchants expanded the trade into sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and even China, which linked the Islamic world to the revived Silk Road. Arabic became the lingua franca of the trade across 3 continents. In Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League emerged, which was a powerful alliance of merchant cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bruges. They controlled the flow of goods across the Baltic and the North Seas, and they would trade salt, furs, grain, and timber. With their own navy and their own legal systems, they were not just traders, they were an economic superpower. The Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa took the trade to the next level. They were positioned perfectly between the East and the West, and they became the middlemen for the luxury goods that were arriving from Asia via the Eastern Mediterranean. The spices, the silks, and the precious stones would flow through their ports, and they would enrich the powerful merchant families like the Medici. Then came the Crusades. While they failed to reclaim the Holy Land, they succeeded in reopening and expanding the East-West connections. The European Crusaders would return not just with scars, but with silks, with spices, and with new appetites. The result? A booming demand for the Eastern goods and a renewed interest in the overland and the maritime trade routes that could deliver them. The guilds emerged to protect the local economies and to standardize the trade. The markets became fairs. The fairs became towns. The towns became cities. The trade was not just reviving, it was institutionalizing. By the late 15th century, the world was on the verge of a dramatic transformation. The age of the ancient trade routes was giving way to a new era, one that was driven by sails, by cannons, and by global ambition. But the foundation for this seismic shift had been laid over the millennia on the backs of camels, of ox carts, and of merchant ships, which were guided by the stars. The explosion of the maritime exploration, which was led by Portugal and by Spain, was not the beginning of the global trade, but its acceleration. Vasco da Gama's sea route to India in 1498 bypassed the land-based Silk Road entirely, and it undercut the Middle Eastern middlemen and it redrew the economic map. Suddenly, the spices, the silks, and the porcelain would flow straight from Asia to Europe, faster, cheaper, and on a scale that had never been seen before. The colonial empires soon followed. The Portuguese set up trading posts from Mozambique to Malacca. The Spanish sailed west and they discovered the Americas, where gold and silver were extracted in vast quantities, and they were shipped across the oceans. The Dutch and the English were not far behind, and they founded the East India Companies that acted like governments with armies, with navies, and with monopolies on the entire trade networks. The ancient land routes like the Silk Road faded in importance, but their legacy endured in the infrastructure, the language, the culture, and the commerce. The trade hubs like Samarkand and Constantinople, though they were diminished, retained the echoes of their former glory. The new cities rose from their legacy: Amsterdam, London, and New York, which were built on the same principles of connectivity and commerce. The modern trade routes, the railroads, the highways, the air corridors, and the undersea cables still trace the patterns that were established by the ancient traders. Globalization may be powered by algorithms and by cargo ships today, but its DNA comes from the Phoenician sea lanes, the Roman roads, and the Indian Ocean monsoons. And the influence is not just economic. The ideas, the religions, the technologies, and even the diseases all followed the trails of the traders. The compass, the printing press, algebra, coffee, and Buddhism, none of these spread without the commerce. The trade did not just move goods, it moved history. So the next time you see a container ship glide across the ocean or a freight train rattle past, remember that it is not just steel and cargo. It is the echo of a Silk Road caravan, the shadow of a Phoenician galley, the pulse of humanity, forever in motion and chasing not just profit, but connection. Tulum is not your typical ancient Maya city. While most of the Maya centers are buried deep in the jungle, and they are surrounded by a dense forest and hidden temples, Tulum rises dramatically above the Caribbean Sea, and it is perched on a limestone cliff that overlooks the turquoise waves. It is a postcard scene with a powerful history, a sacred coastal outpost that stood watch over both the land and the sea. It is located on the eastern edge of the Yucatan Peninsula, in what is now Quintana Roo, Mexico, and Tulum was one of the last major cities that was built and inhabited by the Maya. Its peak came relatively late, between the 13th and the 15th centuries CE, during the post-classic period, just before the Spanish arrival. But despite its late bloom, Tulum left an outsized mark on the Maya history. Its name means wall in the Yucatec Maya, which is a reference to the thick limestone barrier that encloses the city on three sides. The fourth side? That is the open Caribbean Sea, which stretches endlessly to the east. This combination made Tulum uniquely defensible and symbolically significant. According to some accounts, the city may have originally been called Zama, which means City of the Dawn, and it was likely in reference to its perfect alignment with the rising sun. From its cliffs, the Maya lookouts could spot the merchant canoes that were gliding in from Cuba, from Belize, and even from Honduras. Tulum was a key node in a complex maritime trade network, and it would deal in obsidian, jade, salt, honey, textiles, and dried fish. It connected the inland cities like Koba and Chichen Itza to the sea, and its wealth would flow through both the canoes and the caravans. But Tulum was not just a trade hub. It was a spiritual stronghold. Every building, every platform, and every shrine was carefully positioned, and many of them were aligned with the celestial bodies or the sacred dates in the Maya calendar. It was a city that watched the sky as much as it watched the surf. And even after the Spanish arrived and the city was eventually abandoned, Tulum was never truly forgotten. Its ruins remained visible from the sea, a haunting reminder to the passing sailors of a civilization that had charted the stars long before the Europeans had arrived. Tulum may appear small when it is compared to the Maya giants like Chichen Itza or Tikal, but its compactness is deceptive. Every structure within its stone walls was placed with a purpose, and it was guided by astronomy, by spiritual belief, and by strategic design. This was not just a city. It was a cosmic map that was carved into the stone. At its core, Tulum's layout reflects a balance between the earthly and the celestial. The city is surrounded on three sides by thick defensive walls, and each of them are up to 5 meters thick and 3 to 5 meters high, which is a clear statement that Tulum was as concerned with protection as it was with worship. But within those walls lies a careful arrangement of temples, of altars, and of platforms that were aligned with the heavens. The centerpiece of the city is El Castillo, which is not a castle in the European sense, but a temple pyramid that dominates the skyline. It was built on a cliff edge, and it served as both a religious shrine and a lighthouse for the Maya sailors. When the sun rises directly behind it during the key times of the year, it will light up the facade in a perfect symmetry. Some of the scholars believe that it was used to track the solstices and the equinoxes, which allowed the Maya to align their rituals with the rhythms of the cosmos. Next to El Castillo is the Temple of the Descending God, which is named for the carved figure that is above its doorway, a figure with wings and an inverted posture, who is believed to represent a celestial or a fertility deity. This temple faces to the west, and it catches the sunset, and it perhaps symbolizes the transition from the day to the night and from life to death, which were the key themes in the Maya spirituality. Many of the buildings are constructed on raised platforms, and they are oriented along precise axes, which are often northeast-southwest or east-west. These were not arbitrary choices. They echo the Maya obsession with tracking Venus, the sun, and the lunar cycle. Even the doorways and the windows seem to frame the celestial events at certain times of the year. Tulum's planners did not just design a defensible city. They designed a spiritual calendar in stone. It was a place where architecture, astronomy, and mythology would merge into the daily life. Rising above the turquoise sea like a silent sentinel, El Castillo is Tulum's most iconic structure. It is positioned at the edge of a limestone cliff, and it commands not just the coastline, but the heavens. It is a fusion of engineering, of astronomy, and of sacred symbolism. Though it is not as massive as the Great Pyramids of the inland Maya cities, El Castillo was never meant to compete in its size. It was meant to signal. It was built in stages, and El Castillo likely served multiple roles: a temple, a shrine, a watchtower, and possibly even a lighthouse. During the day, its high elevation and its stark stone facade made it visible from far out at sea. For the Maya sailors who were navigating the Caribbean in large dugout canoes, El Castillo marked both a physical and a spiritual harbor, a beacon of protection under the watchful eye of the gods. But it was not just a daytime guide. At night, fires may have been lit in the temple on top of the structure. It was paired with small windows, and it was aligned with the seaward gaps in the reef, and the glow could be used to help the mariners to safely reach Tulum's shore through the narrow breaks in the coral. This would make El Castillo one of the earliest examples of a lighthouse-like structure in the Americas. Religiously, El Castillo was likely dedicated to the diving god or the descending god, a celestial figure who was connected to Venus, the planet that played a central role in the Maya cosmology. The Maya believed that Venus influenced warfare, agriculture, and the calendar. The structures like El Castillo were used to track its appearances in the sky. During the specific dates in the solar and the Venusian calendars, the sun would rise or set directly in line with the temple, and it would bathe it in a radiant light, a moment of cosmic synchronization. The temple itself is modest in its size, but it is elevated for a maximum visibility. Its stairways and its niches suggest that the rituals were held on top, where the priests would perform ceremonies that were visible from the plaza and the coastline below. Unlike the massive ceremonial complexes that were inland, El Castillo was not about grandeur. It was about function, guiding the ships, channeling the solar energy, and connecting the sea with the sky. It is tucked near the center of Tulum's ceremonial core, and it is one of its most fascinating and spiritually charged buildings, the Temple of the Frescoes. Unlike the imposing height of El Castillo, this structure draws the eye not through its scale but through its intricate detail. It is a multi-level temple complex that is rich with symbolism, with iconography, and with some of the finest surviving Maya murals on the Yucatan coast. The temple served a dual purpose as a shrine and as an observatory. The upper level likely functioned as a ritual space for the priests, while the lower chamber housed the painted murals and the stone carvings that brought the Maya cosmos to life. Though the weather and the time have eroded many of the original pigments, enough detail remains to offer a stunning glimpse into the Maya spiritual thought. Inside, the frescoes depict a pantheon of gods, of deities, and of supernatural creatures. The most prominent among them is the descending god, who is often shown upside down, a rare and an intriguing figure in the Maya art. This god, who is associated with Venus, with fertility, and possibly with bees, appears in multiple places throughout Tulum, which reinforces his importance to the city's identity. The murals also show scenes of creation, of underworld journeys, and of cosmic battles. The sky bands, the earth monsters, and the celestial symbols swirl together in a painted narrative that reflected the Maya view of a multi-layered universe. For the Maya, the world was divided into three parts: the heavens above, the earthly realm, and the watery underworld below, all of which appear in these frescoes in a striking visual form. On the exterior, the temple is adorned with stucco masks and niches. Some of these likely held offerings or small idols. The columns support the portico, which gives the structure an almost Greco-Maya appearance, a rare architectural feature in this region. Astronomically, the Temple of the Frescoes is thought to have been aligned with the key solar events. The windows and the sightlines may have marked the solstices or the equinoxes, which helped the priests to maintain the sacred calendar. It was both a house of worship and a timekeeping device, and it was as functional as it was beautiful. Among Tulum's sacred structures, none is more enigmatic than the Temple of the Descending God. It is modest in its scale, but it is rich in its symbolism, and this temple is dedicated to one of the most mysterious deities in the Maya pantheon, a figure who is depicted upside down with his wings or his headdress flared, and he is descending from the heavens. His image appears throughout Tulum, which suggests a guardian presence, a celestial overseer of the city that is perched between the sea and the sky. It is located just to the west of El Castillo, and the temple stands on top of a small platform. It has a single-room sanctuary with a narrow stairway and a prominent niche above the doorway. And there, in the niche, is the defining element. The stucco relief of the descending god, head first, with his knees bent and his arms outstretched, as though he is in mid-flight or in mid-fall. No one knows his true name, but the scholars have linked him to Kinnichahau, who was the sun god, or possibly to a bee deity who was revered for his role in pollination and in honey production, which were essential elements in the Maya agriculture and the ritual. The descending posture is rare in the Maya art and architecture. Typically, the deities are shown upright, they are enthroned, or they are in combat. But here, the inverted figure suggests a spiritual inversion, a messenger between the worlds, who is bringing the divine influence down into the human realm. Some of the interpretations connect him to Venus, which was the morning star, and it was a powerful celestial body in the Maya astronomy that was associated with the cycles of war, of rebirth, and of sacrifice. The temple itself is aligned to capture the light of the setting sun, which creates a dramatic visual spectacle during certain times of the year. This alignment may have signaled the ritual dates or the seasonal transitions. For Tulum's priests, such moments were not just beautiful. They were divine appointments. The temple would have held offerings, incense burners, and possibly the ashes or the bones of the elite individuals. Though it was small, it was a site of an intense spiritual significance, a space to commune with the sky, to interpret the omens, and to perform the rites under the watching gaze of the descending god. This figure, with his wings spread and his body inverted, became a symbol of Tulum itself, a city that stood on the edge of the land, between the sky and the sea, at the turning point of the calendar and the cosmos. While Tulum is celebrated for its temples and its astronomical alignments, its physical defenses tell a different kind of story, one of protection, of strategy, and of geopolitical awareness. Unlike most of the ancient Maya cities, which would sprawl openly across the landscape, Tulum was built like a fortress. 3 massive stone walls encircle the inland sides of the city, while the fourth edge ends in a sheer cliff above the Caribbean Sea. It was not just sacred, it was secure. The walls are impressive even today. They are up to 5 meters thick, and they are as high as 5 meters in some places, with narrow passageways that could be easily defended. These were not symbolic boundaries. They were practical military installations that were built to repel raiders, pirates, or rival city-states. The entrances were small and they were few, and they would force any intruder to enter single file, which would make them vulnerable and exposed. Strategically placed along the perimeter were the watchtowers, which were squat, round buildings with small windows or slits that offered clear lines of sight over the land and the sea. From here, the guards could spot the approaching canoes long before they reached the shore. These towers may have also doubled as communication points, and they may have used smoke or fire signals to alert the city's elite of any threat or arrival. But these defenses also had a spiritual dimension. To the Maya, the walls did not just keep the enemies out. They separated the sacred from the profane. Inside the walls was the holy space, where the temples were aligned with the cosmos, the rituals echoed the stars, and every step was watched by the gods. Outside was the wilderness, the unknown, and the unstable world of politics and warfare. The positioning of Tulum also gave it an incredible control over both the land and the sea routes. It lay along the Maya coastal trade network, which was a major artery for the goods that were moving up and down the Yucatan Peninsula. The salt, the honey, the jade, the obsidian, and the cacao would pass through its gates. Any merchant who was sailing the coast would see Tulum's cliffside silhouette long before they reached it, a powerful reminder of its power and its protection. In Tulum, strength and sanctity were never far apart. Long before there were colonial ports and international harbors, Tulum was a thriving maritime trading post, a coastal checkpoint that linked the inland Maya cities with the Caribbean world. Its location was not chosen for its beauty alone. It was strategically perched above the sea, with an access to sheltered landing beaches, and Tulum was built to connect. The Maya were expert seafarers. They would carve massive dugout canoes from the ceiba trees, and some of them were large enough to carry 20 to 30 people and hundreds of pounds of cargo. These vessels would paddle up and down the Yucatan coastline, and they would travel as far as modern-day Honduras to the south and the Gulf Coast to the north. With the prevailing currents and the consistent trade winds, the Maya merchants would follow the well-established maritime routes that turned Tulum into a key stop. The goods would flow in from every direction. From the inland highlands came the obsidian, the jade, and the cacao, valuable items that were used in ritual and in elite exchange. From the coastal regions, the merchants would bring salt, dried fish, cotton textiles, honey, feathers, and shells. Tulum did not produce all of these items itself. Instead, it served as a distribution point where the goods could be stored, they could be taxed, and they could be redirected along the network. What made Tulum unique was its combination of a sea access and a defensive structure. Unlike the open coastal towns, Tulum had walls. This meant not just a protection from the raiders, but also a control over who came in and who went out. The goods were monitored, the elites would collect the tribute, and the priests would likely bless the transactions, which reinforces the idea that the trade and the ritual were closely intertwined in the Maya society. The foreign merchants may have passed through as well. Some of the ceramic styles and the imported objects suggest a contact with other Mesoamerican peoples, including those from central Mexico and the Gulf Coast. Tulum was not isolated. It was plugged into a regional system that pulsed with an economic, a cultural, and a spiritual energy. The canoes would likely pull into the small landing beaches just below the cliffs, where the goods would be offloaded and they would be carried up into the city. From there, they could be exchanged, they could be stored, or they could be carried inland by human porters to the major cities like Koba. Tulum was a crossroads not just of geography, but of identity. For centuries, Tulum thrived as a sacred stronghold and a bustling trade port. But like all the great cities, its dominance eventually faded. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, Tulum was still standing, but it was already in decline. Its walls were still intact, its temples were still visible from the sea, but its golden age was clearly behind it. So what happened? Tulum's decline was likely gradual, and it was not catastrophic. There is no evidence of war or of violent destruction, and no signs of a mass fire or an invasion. Instead, it seems that the city slowly lost its strategic importance. As the trade networks shifted and the larger inland centers like Chichen Itza and Mayapan rose and fell, Tulum's influence began to wane. The economic arteries that had once flowed through its gates may have been rerouted elsewhere. There is also the broader context of the Maya civilization. By the late post-classic period, many of the Maya cities were already experiencing a political fragmentation, shifting alliances, and declining populations. The environmental stresses, which included droughts and soil exhaustion, likely contributed to the instability across the Yucatan. These factors would have rippled out to Tulum, even if it was more coastal and less dependent on agriculture. Then came the Spanish. In 1518, the Spanish explorer Juan de Grijalva sailed past Tulum. His crew noted the city's tall stone buildings and its imposing walls. They were struck by its scale and its structure. A few years later, during Hernán Cortés's expedition to Honduras, the Spanish again passed by Tulum, and they remarked on its beauty and the towering temple that stood like a sentinel over the sea. But they did not stop to conquer it, not right away. By the end of the 16th century, however, Tulum was abandoned. Whether it was through disease, the disruption of the trade, or the cultural upheaval that was brought by the colonization and the Christianity, its people gradually left. What remained were the empty temples, the wind-worn walls, and the echo of the rituals that were once performed under the stars. Yet Tulum never fully disappeared. Unlike many of the jungle-wrapped Maya ruins, it stood exposed, and it was visible from the water, a ghost city on the cliff. The sailors would pass it for centuries, and its silhouette was a marker of a world that had slipped into memory. Long after its last incense had burned and its final traders had departed, Tulum stood silent above the sea, not lost, but waiting. Unlike the jungle cities like Palenque or Calakmul, Tulum was never completely buried. Its cliffside perch kept it visible to the sailors and the locals alike. But it was not until the 19th century that it re-entered the world's historical imagination. In 1842, two explorers, John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood, arrived in Tulum during their now famous expedition through the Maya world. Stephens, who was an American diplomat, and Catherwood, who was a British artist, were among the first Europeans to document the ruins in detail. Catherwood's illustrations of El Castillo and the Temple of the Descending God mesmerized the European readers, and Tulum quickly gained fame as one of the most photogenic and accessible of the Maya sites. The archaeological work increased in the 20th century. The Mexican government began preservation efforts, and they stabilized the structures and they cleared the vegetation. Unlike the deeper jungle ruins, Tulum was relatively easy to access, and it soon became a popular destination, not just for the historians but for the tourists, the photographers, and the spiritual seekers. Today, Tulum is one of the most visited archaeological sites in Mexico. Thousands of people walk through its stone gates each day, and they pass the temples that once aligned with the stars and the walls that once defended the sacred ground. The visitors stand where the Maya priests once charted Venus in the sky and where the sailors once saw the city emerge like a vision from the waves. Yet the real magic of Tulum lies in what it continues to reveal. The new studies are using LiDAR scanning and satellite mapping to uncover more about the site's original layout and its connections to the inland cities like Coba. The scholars are still debating the true identity of the descending god, the precise function of El Castillo, and the exact reasons for the city's fall. But beyond the questions, Tulum remains a symbol of the Maya resilience, their architectural genius, and their cosmic curiosity. It reminds us that the ancient people were not isolated in the past. They navigated the oceans, they tracked the stars, they built observatories, and they structured their cities around cycles that were larger than themselves. Tulum is not just ruins on a cliff. It is a living testament to a civilization that saw the universe as something to align with, not to conquer. And that vision still echoes every time the rising sun spills across the stone.